Hello, good evening everyone. Thanks for coming along on this chilly evening. It'll definitely be worth it, I promise. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on Dja Dja Wurrung country, acknowledge them as the traditional owners of the land, and having been here for at least 40,000 years, having gained a connection with the land that they live on, and acknowledging not only what the land can do for them, but what they can do for the land as conservationists. So I'm going to hand you over to another conservationist, Mr. Brian Walters, who 40 years ago rafted down the Franklin River in what is an almost mythic feat to me, who was born 15 years after the event. I'm hearing about it from my hippie parents as something just incredible that was done when they were young. So I'm very much looking forward to Brian speaking today. Please give him a warm welcome.
Well, thanks very much, Geordie. I'm going to try and speak without a microphone. I hope you can hear me okay. Before I commence, can I ask, is there anyone here who was involved in the Franklin campaign? Could you put your hand up, please? So Diane and Peter. And did you go to the blockade at all, or Peter did? Yeah. And a few rallies and things, I imagine, too, and a bit of letterboxing.
Filming.
Well, big hand to Diane and Peter. On Boxing Day 1982, with a group of friends, I left the Collingwood River Bridge on the Lyell Highway and rafted down the Collingwood River to its confluence with the Franklin River. For the next 10 days, in what was then a serious undertaking, we rafted down the Franklin River. It's a wonderful experience. Honey-coloured waters taking you past ravines and gorges, more waterfalls than I've seen in the whole of the rest of my life put together. And we joined the blockade to stop the damming of this river for power that no one needed. Now, along the lower reaches of the Franklin, the river is about as wide as the Murray at Echuca, and it's fast flowing. It's a big river. And along that stretch of the river, we searched along the limestone cliffs using handwritten directions that we'd obtained with a good deal of trouble, and eventually found Kutikina Cave, which had only been rediscovered about a year before. This cave was inhabited for over 8,000 years, commencing 21,000 years ago and concluding some 13,000 years ago. It's a cave about twice the size of a suburban house. It's divided into two large chambers with shafts of light coming down from apertures high above. There was a small area about 1 metre square that had been the subject of a preliminary dig by archaeologists. It was lined with river stones and 4 pieces of wood just to protect it. And the whole floor for this cave is covered with flakes of stone, scraping and cutting tools. It just littered the floor. There are hundreds and hundreds of them. In one corner near the entrance, just sort of on that side, was what had clearly been the fireplace. You could still see the black of the smoke after all those thousands of years. and behind the fireplace there was a fissure dropping right down, and it was choked with animal bones. Bones picked clean by families before the times of the Old Testament. Bones of animals that no longer could be found anywhere near Kutikaina Cave today. Now I stood there on a rainy morning looking out onto dripping tree ferns and wondered what it must have been like for the people who lived there all those thousands of years before. As I stood there in awe, elected politicians, public servants, contractors were working to ensure that all this, which had only just been rediscovered, would be flooded and lost forever. It seemed unthinkable that they could succeed. From the cave, we went back out to our rafts and continued down the river to the point where the Franklin flows into the Gordon, at which point we were immediately circled by a police launch. Now, how did all this come about? In 1972, despite a desperate campaign by the public, the Tasmanian government had a hydroelectric commission, and the hydro flooded Lake Pedder. This beautiful lake with it's the jewel of the southwest, with its fluted pink quartzite beaches, its spectacular cradle of rugged mountains, was the meeting point of all the long-distance walking tracks in the southwest and the heart of remote places in Australia, and it had been protected in a national park since 1955. Olegas Trikanus was a Lithuanian-born photographer whose audio-visual presentations of Pedder mesmerised packed crowds in public halls all across Tasmania and galvanised opposition to the project. And as he put it, is there any reason why Tasmania should not be more beautiful on the day we leave it than on the day we came? If we can revise our attitudes towards the land under our feet, if we can accept the role of steward and depart from the role of the conqueror, if we can accept that man and nature are inseparable parts of a unified whole, then Tasmania can be a shining beacon in a dull, uniform and largely artificial world. Olegas decided to kayak down the splits on the Gordon River for one last time, because that area also would be flooded by this scheme. And as he tried to step out of his kayak above a waterfall, he slipped on a wet rock, and his companion, Kevin Kiernan, saw him sucked downstream. Kevin Kiernan walked out and raised the alarm, and it was Olegas's protege, Latvian-born photographer Peter Dombrovskis, who found Olegas's body 3 days later. Both Kevin Kiernan and Peter Dombrovskis will return in this story. Now, the leader of the Pedder campaign, the figurehead really, was Brenda Heen. She was very well connected. She was a piano teacher, very proper, very correct, very conservative, or so she appeared. And she announced in 1972 that she would be travelling to Canberra to lobby federal politicians to save Lake Pedder. And that day she received a strange phone call. The voice asked her, who didn't identify himself, asked her why she was going to Canberra, and she said why. And the voice finished with the ominous words, "How would you like to go for a swim?" She took off in a tiger moth piloted by Max Price, also a leader of the PETA campaign. There was an ABC journalist to see them leave, and neither they nor their plane were ever seen again. There was evidence that the hangar had been broken into, but the police investigation was soon closed inconclusively. Lake PETA was sacrificed for less than 60 megawatts of power. Just to put that in context, Victoria's Latrobe Valley produces about 7,000 megawatts. The lake itself doesn't produce any power, or the dam. All it does is allow water to go across the surface into the next valley where it can be used for power. It's just a watery platform, really, to enable more water to be flow through to the Gordon. So the reaction to this flooding of Lake PETA was a searing awareness that established interests were operating in Tasmania in a corrupt way, and the United Tasmania Group was formed. It was the world's first Green Party, and in the 1972 state election narrowly failed to win a seat in the Tasmanian State Parliament. One of its unsuccessful candidates was a young Launceston GP, Bob Brown. The group which campaigned to save Lake PETA was called the South West Tasmania Action Committee, SWTAC. So back in the 1930s, the Tasmanian government adopted the strategy of attracting industry to the state by harnessing hydroelectric power. The spruik was that this would become the Ruhr of the South. The strategy did meet with some initial success, and it became conventional wisdom in the state. But the development model continued well past its utility. The hydro kept building dams and employed many people. It was well connected with industry, and it became highly influential in Tasmanian politics. Neither major party would take on the hydro or question its paradigm. The dams became increasingly expensive, generated less and less power, and moved into more and more remote parts of the state. As the waters drowned Lake PETA, those who mourned its passing began to wonder, where will the hydro strike next? So in February 1976, that Launceston GP, Dr. Bob Brown, accepted Forester Paul Smith's invitation to raft the Franklin River using inflatable rubber rafts. This river was the last major river in Tasmania not dammed anywhere along its length. It was wild, remote, astonishingly beautiful, and hardly known. It had been canoed once in 1958, that party having come to grief in 2 previous attempts, and had been descended a hair-raising and near fatal trip in lashed timber and rubber inner tube rafts in 1971. That was all. Those were the only times it had been descended. So the 1976 trip was the first time anyone had used inflatable rafts on the river. And there he is, a young Bob Brown on that trip. On the way, Bob Brown named many of the features along the river. To give one example, Irenibus, or Chasm of Peace, is a very apt name for a beautiful gorge where the track comes down to the river from Frenchman's Cap, but also honours his beloved Aunt Irene. That's the Erinibis, and it's often photographed, and there are many different perspectives on it. It's a very beautiful, quiet part of the river. Now, towards the end of this trip, Brown and Smith were suddenly confronted with barges, jackhammers, explosions. Hydrogeologists were surveying for a potential dam site. They came across maps which showed that they intended to dam the Franklin and to put further dams right up the river. Determined to preempt the hydro's plans, Paul Smith returned with Bob and made a film about the river to publicise its beauty. In June 1976, at Bob Brown's home in Liffey, a meeting of conservationists changed the name of the South West Tasmania Action Committee to the Tasmanian Wilderness Society. Kevin Kiernan, who'd been a key figure in the Pedder campaign, and we heard about him previously with Olagus tricanus, initially headed this organisation. But he was burnt out by the Pedder experience, and he's written movingly about what it was like. To quote him, "I cannot speak for others, but I saw my temple ransacked by my own community. Pedder was the cradle of my adult life. Many of us were matured by the experience. I have seen friends grow up and some have aged terribly. My own soul seems haunted by an unwanted legacy of cynicism and distrust." So he was followed as director by Norm Sanders, who's a scientist and media personality who'd come from the States. By this time it was clear that the hydro wanted to flood the Franklin, the last major wild river in Tasmania. Campaigning was underway in earnest, with Paul Smith's film being shown on Tasmanian television, and with public meetings and community stalls being held to publicise the issue. In December 1978, after a bushwalk, I went to the Salamanca market in Hobart, and there was a small stall. It was a card table with a poster about that big, calling for the saving of the Franklin River. It was the first time I'd heard about the issue. In 1979, with Norm Sanders hoping to run for Parliament representing the Democrats, Dr. Bob Brown took leave from his practice in Launceston to take over as director of the Tasmanian Wilderness Society, and from that time on he was the public face of the Franklin campaign. In October 1979, the hydro publicly and formally recommended the flooding of the Franklin River by the construction of a dam on the Gordon River below its confluence with the Franklin. There were covert plans for further dams right up the Franklin and on the Davey and King Rivers. Now, there was no economic case put in support of this dam. There was no cost-benefit analysis. The flooding of this river was to take place without any demonstrable economic benefit, despite the fact that it would cost millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. There was a strong reaction. Large public meetings were held and thousands of people attended, and the campaign began to develop momentum. In countless meetings and interviews, Bob Brown articulated a vision of a Tasmania which valued its beauty and its natural legacy. He inspired people all over Australia and beyond. In 1980, a public opinion poll was commissioned by the Tasmanian Wilderness Society, and it showed at that time that most Tasmanians opposed the construction of the dam, and it received front page coverage in the Launceston Examiner. On the 11th of July 1980, the Labor government under Premier Doug Lowe reached a compromise decision. A dam would be built on the Gordon River, but above the Franklin confluence, the so-called Gordon above Olga scheme. And that would save the Franklin River itself. It was the first time any government had stood up to the hydro and refused to follow its recommendations. It appeared that the Franklin had been saved, albeit at the cost of another dam on the Gordon River. In November 1980, Tasmania's Legislative Assembly passed the legislation for the Gordon above Olga Dam to proceed. However, the following month, a Legislative Council, that's to say Upper House Select Committee, recommended the construction of the Gordon below Franklin Dam that would flood the Franklin. The chairman of that committee, Harry Braid, had in fact rafted down the Franklin with Bob Brown and appeared to be impressed by what he saw, but then he had a return visit to the area courtesy of the hydro and came out in favour of the dam. So the Legislative Council wanted to flood the Franklin and amended the legislation to permit the Gordon below Franklin Dam to proceed. So Tasmania's two Houses of Parliament were deadlocked. In February 1981, a further dimension to the issue came to light when Kevin Kiernan, who we've heard of before, by now an archaeologist, discovered the archaeological significance of Kootikina Cave, which he called Fraser Cave, to flatter Malcolm Fraser in the hope that he would then save the Franklin River. The dam would flood this Aboriginal heritage if it went ahead. So Premier Doug Lowe was impatient with Upper House obstruction, and he proclaimed the Franklin Lower Gordon Wild Rivers National Park. So now the Legislative Council had to deal with the fact that this was all in a national park. However, in June 1981, the union-led majority of the ALP State Conference pushed through a motion calling for a referendum to settle the Franklin issue. Now, this was a back down to the Legislative Council, and it was a refusal to support the Labor government's position. So the union movement was actively undermining its own Labor government. That August, the first secret meetings were held of a few people in the Wilderness Society preparing for an eventuality they hoped would not be needed, a non-violent blockade of dam works. Now that month I travelled to Tasmania. I'd met Bob Brown the year before and I interviewed him for the new magazine Wild, and then I went with friends to the West Coast. We stayed in Queenstown, the impoverished town with its history of mining, where I witnessed deep suspicion towards outsiders, particularly anyone who looked like they were mainlanders, or still worse, greenies. It was an economically depressed area and the concern about jobs was palpable. We went on to Strawn, where we took a tourist boat. It was August, it was the middle of winter, it was not really tourist weather, but anyway, across Macquarie Harbour and up the dark waters of the Gordon River, past the mouth of the Franklin, and looked out on the seemingly impenetrable rainforest on both sides. It's really wild country. Now, the conservationists promoted schemes which would mean jobs for the West Coast, and in particular they promoted the APT railway, the reconstruction of the Apt Railway, which had formerly run between Queenstown and Strahan. And they said, you know, reopening this would mean a lot of jobs because there'd be construction works and it would mean there'd be ongoing tourist infrastructure for the area. And they were ridiculed for that because people had started to get into their trenches about this. But of course, today the Apt Railway has been reopened and it is a major drawcard in the area. So in September 81, the ALP caucus, the MPs, voted to hold a referendum to resolve the impasse between the two houses of Parliament. When Premier Doug Lowe walked out of the party room to speak to a press conference announcing the decision, he was asked, "Will there be a no dams option?" And he answered, "Yes." The state president of the Labor Party then wrote to all MPs requiring them to remove the no dams option, and the Premier was forced to hold another press conference announcing that this option would be removed. So it was a choice between the two dams, but without the ability to say no. Now, as I followed these events from the mainland, it was unthinkable that we could lose this campaign. A greedy, foolish set of vested interests was squandering this beautiful place for no good purpose. It seemed imperative to our future that the Franklin be saved. And that determination fired thousands of people. That month in Canberra, the Senate voted to establish a select committee to examine the issue, the first federal involvement. Back in Tasmania, the referendum campaign got underway for a vote on the 12th of December 1981. As I say, the only options offered to the people of Tasmania were the two dam projects, the Gordon above Olga Dam or the Gordon below Franklin. It was the first and indeed only referendum in Australian history without the no as an option. At this point, the Tasmanian Wilderness Society adopted a risky strategy. Voters would be urged not to mark either option, but to write no dams across their ballot papers, rendering them informal. This was asking a great deal of conservative Tasmanians, and it also abandoned the Gordon above Olga scheme. It was all or nothing. Soon cars began sporting yellow and sometimes green triangular stickers with the words "No dams." This became one of the enduring images of the campaign, and it is in fact the origin of the Greens triangle that we see today. On the 10th of November 1981, so still with the referendum a couple of months away, a month away, Robin Gray, a hardliner for the Franklin Dam, was elected Tasmanian opposition leader of the Liberal Party. Late that day, Premier Doug Lowe, following years of lobbying from Jeff Mosley, director of the ACF, and others, signed the nomination of the area for inscription on the World Heritage List. He didn't pass this through Cabinet. He was about to put the letter through the normal out tray when a public servant offered to take it and post it immediately himself, which proved to be decisive. The following morning, the 11th of November 1981, Doug Lowe was defeated in caucus and resigned as Premier of Tasmania, to be replaced by Harry Holgate, a former journalist and pro-dam advocate who'd been working for some time to undermine Doug Lowe. If the letter had still been in his out tray, it would never have been posted. At question time that afternoon, Doug Lowe entered the chamber, but instead of moving to the backbench, he shocked the Parliament by walking quietly to the crossbenches to sit as an independent. Norm Sanders, the only Democrat MP in the Tasmanian Parliament, was also on the crossbenches. The following week, with the referendum campaign well underway, Mary Wiley, the ALP government whip and a fervent opponent of the dam, crossed the floor to join Doug Lowe on the crossbenches, depriving the Labor government of its majority. The Franklin issue was causing havoc in Tasmanian politics. When the referendum was held, the vote for the Gordon above Olga dam was 8%. The vote for the Gordon below Franklin dam was 47%, still not a majority. The informal vote was 45%, the highest in Australian history. The result created further trouble for the doomed Labor government. In January 1982, the Holgate government moved to change policy and support the flooding of the Franklin, a project not supported by the majority at the referendum. That month, the first secret reconnaissance missions into the area to prepare for the non-violent blockade of dam building works took place. Now, there was at that time only limited history of non-violent blockades in Australia. Since then, reasonably commonplace in things like logging protests. And those blockades, there'd been such blockades at Terania Creek and Nightcap in northern New South Wales, but that was little known in the wider community or the wider conservation movement. And it all seemed a very risky strategy, with many very afraid of the prospect of violence. To avoid violence, careful preparations and training in non-violent action were undertaken over a long time. The blockade planners had three goals in view: to generate enormous publicity with a view to placing pressure on the politicians, to make a show of commitment, strength and determination by having many people arrested and jailed, and also to slow down and even stop work. In charge of plans for this blockade, which was an enormous undertaking, was Cathy Plowman. She was 24 years old, and she'd moved to Tasmania to take on this task. In the summer of 1981-2, while I was between jobs, I stayed at the Bellarive Youth Hostel and worked as a volunteer for the Tasmanian Wilderness Society. I'd gone bushwalking in Tasmania every summer for many years, and the wild places of Tasmania were like a second home for me. And working as a volunteer in a essentially dog's body role, I got to know most of the key players in this campaign, and it was a formative and very exciting time, just as the plans for the blockade, which at that stage was a year away, were taking shape. In an attempt to sell the dam, the government announced the appointment of TV naturalist Harry Butler to advise on conservation issues with the dam. Now, Harry Butler had already made an ad for the Australian Conservation Foundation against the dam, and his credibility was now in tatters, and it was the end of his career, for those of you who remember him as a naturalist. On the 26th of March 1982, Parliament was recalled. A motion of no confidence was moved in the government over its handling of the dams dispute, and the government fell. An election was called for the 15th of May. 2.5 years on from the Hydro's formal recommendation that the dam should be built, there'd still been no legislation to bring about the Gordon Below Franklin Dam. But opposition leader Robin Gray promised to do so as soon as he won the election. At this election, Bob Brown stood as an independent candidate in the Hobart seat of Denison. Now, Bob was openly gay, having come out in a TV interview some years before. At that time, homosexuality was still a crime in Tasmania. The pro-dam Liberal Party held a rally in St David's Park in Hobart and released hundreds of balloons, each with the slogan, "Brown is a Green Queen," on them. They letterboxed every house in Hobart, attacking Bob Brown for being gay. The result of the election was a landslide to the pro-dam Liberals led by Robin Gray, nicknamed the Whispering Bulldozer. Bob Brown narrowly failed to win a seat, which is probably just as well because he was needed elsewhere at the time. But his preferences ensured that Norm Sanders, the only Democrat in the House and a strong opponent to the dam, was re-elected. The Gray government's first initiative was the bill for the Gordon Below Franklin Dam. It passed on the 16th of June 1982. The next day, in a case in which I had tangential involvement, by this time I was a junior barrister, the Wilderness Society applied to the High Court to prevent funding to Tasmania for the dam via the Loans Council. Now, when I say I had tangential involvement, I wasn't in the case, too big a case for me then, but I helped advise who should be in the case and gave some background advice. Justice Mason of the High Court dismissed the arguments, and that was interpreted as a green light for the dam. Big business and the Hydro had finally won control in Tasmania, and the only hope for the Franklin, a slim one, was intervention by the federal government. Bob Brown went to Canberra and met with the Liberal Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser, hoping for federal intervention. Now, Fraser actually had quite a good environmental record. He'd already taken the bold step of ending whaling in Australia, but at that time he was preoccupied. He said to Brown that people with lost causes in Tasmania shouldn't come to Canberra hoping for rescue. The meeting lasted only minutes. It looked like the dam would be built. However, one thing Malcolm Fraser did do was submit the nomination sent by Doug Lowe in his last act as Premier for the Wild Rivers area to be inscribed on the World Heritage List, and he resisted strenuous requests by Robin Gray to withdraw the nomination. In July 1982, the ALP National Conference was held in Canberra. A strong conservation lobby group contingent led by Bob Brown attended, and every delegate was lobbied. And after considerable manoeuvring, the conference passed by a narrow majority the following motion: a Labor government will oppose the construction of a hydroelectric power scheme on the Gordon and Franklin rivers. That meant that the dam would be an issue at the forthcoming federal election, whenever that might be held. On the 17th of July 1982, in secrecy and under cover of darkness, the first bulldozers were moved onto the Kelly Basin Road and the trucks started running. Work on the dam had commenced. In response, the Wilderness Society announced plans to blockade the dam building works. The plans by this time had been carefully laid. A prefabricated communication centre had been constructed in Hobart and food was stockpiled. Tourist operator and former Huon-Piner Reg Morrison made his boat, the J. Lee M, available for the use of the Wilderness Society, and that was vital because all supplies, food, radio equipment, tents, rafts, had to be, for hundreds of people, had to be moved over 50 kilometres from Strawn upriver to the blockade area. An aircraft was made available also. Workshops in non-violence were held around Australia, it being essential that protesters never react with violence, whatever the provocations or dangers. Bob Brown said that conservationists would oppose the construction of the dam to the last bucket of cement. On the 2nd of September 1982, the Grey government, by proclamation, excised 14,125 hectares of the Wild Rivers National Park and vested the land in the Hydroelectric Commission. That day, a re-declaration party was held on the Gordon River, and the Advance Party pledged to preserve the area and declared the area an inviolable national park for all time. Heat built up over the issue. In Parliament, Robin Gray described the Franklin River as nothing but a brown ditch, leech-ridden, unattractive to the majority of people. He also said you've either got to be superbly fit or mentally ill to go rafting down the Franklin. On the 16th of September 1982, Robin Gray threatened that Tasmania would secede from the Commonwealth if the federal government intervened to stop work on the dam. It was made illegal to enter the lands vested in the Hydroelectric Commission without a written permit. On the 9th of October 1982, in pouring rain, 4,000 people attended a Sydney rally opposing the dam. Momentum was beginning to build on the mainland. With work underway on the dam, Robin Gray issued a press statement referring to Bob Brown and his cronies. Conservationists training for the Southwest Blockade are like guerrilla forces in third world countries. The Tasmanian people have spoken. Only one isolated group, determined to get its way through misinformation, obstruction and, if need be, violence, has not come to terms with the reality of the situation in this state. But Robin Gray didn't hold all the cards. On the 14th of November in Melbourne, a walk for wilderness was held with self-professed pommy botanist and TV celebrity Professor David Bellamy. The police estimate was 15,000 people walked, making this the largest conservation gathering in Australian history. I was there. I think it was a lot more than 15,000. It was a huge crowd. Bob Brown spoke, along with representatives of both the Labor and Liberal parties. Malcolm Fraser was in hospital, and Karen Alexander, who headed the campaign in Victoria, produced a huge get well card and that had been prepared for him, asking him to come back and save the Franklin. On the 23rd of November 1982, the Senate Select Committee presented an interim report on power in Tasmania. It found that no new power scheme was needed in Tasmania for at least 3 years, if ever. The decision to build a dam was now nationally exposed as economic nonsense. The next day, the Tasmanian government amended the Police Offences Act to make trespass, which carried a maximum penalty of $100, an arrestable offence. Now, on the 4th of December 1982, following the death of the Federal Treasurer Philip Lynch, a by-election was held in the federal seat of Flinders in Victoria. 40.4% of voters wrote no dams on their ballot papers. The by-election over, the Fraser government announced that it would not intervene to save the Franklin. Robin Gray appeared at a rally in Queenstown wearing boxing gloves. The blockade was due to commence in less than a week. In Paris, UNESCO met to consider the Australian government's nomination of the Franklin and Lower Gordon Rivers. Quite improperly, the Tasmanian government, which had no standing in an international forum, lobbied against Australia's submissions, arguing the area should not be included in the World Heritage List. Unanimously, UNESCO found that the area satisfied all the criteria for World Heritage, including its outstanding natural beauty and its cultural significance, and that it should be inscribed on the World Heritage List. It is in fact the first place that was ever found to satisfy all the criteria of World Heritage. Day one of the blockade was the 14th of December 1982, the day that southwest Tasmania became a World Heritage Area. The World Heritage Committee expressed its concern about the prospects of a dam and recommended that the Australian government take all possible measures to protect the integrity of the property. That day, the Senate passed the Democrats' World Heritage Protection Bill. On the river, rubber duckies trailed out to make a blockade across the Gordon River at Warner's Landing. At first there was some level of chaos about all of this, as you can imagine, and Ross Scott, who I'd known for many years, suggested that everyone hold up their paddles vertically, and the resultant striking image, a line of rafts across the river with paddles like a row of pickets, was seen across the country. There were also actions at the ADIT site and on drill rigs, as well as other actions further upstream on the Franklin. In all, 54 people were arrested that day. The media coverage was extraordinary, almost unprecedented. Spontaneous rallies with thousands attending occurred at Sydney, Canberra, Hobart, Launceston and Bendigo. The first person processed in court was Bob Burton, who now runs the Tasmanian Inquirer, who'd been working on the Franklin campaign for some years and who I knew quite well at that time. He got to court and he was asked, without any notice, whether he would accept the bail conditions that he would not, quote, lurk, loiter, hide or secrete, unquote, himself on the HEC property. He declined and was remanded in jail. He was joined by 45 others on that day alone. Now, the restriction on where people could go was widely seen as an abuse by the authorities of the bail process. If you were convicted of this charge, the most that could happen to you was a $100 fine. Yet people were held in prison for weeks on bail conditions ancillary to that charge. There were daily actions and arrests. On the 16th of December, Bob Brown, pardon me, wearing a jumper and tie, was arrested at St John Falls, and news footage around the country captured him smiling and shaking the hand of the arresting officer. He didn't accept the bail conditions and was remanded in custody. On the 22nd of December, workers left the area for Christmas. But already there'd been 202 arrests with 167 imprisoned. The issue became global. Prince Charles in Wales said that he found that the arguments in favour of the dam not terribly convincing. Norm Sanders resigned his seat in Parliament so he could run for the Federal Senate. Now that meant, under the Hare-Clark system which operates in Tasmania, that there would be a recount. What happens in Tasmania if there's a casual vacancy, there's 7 people elected for each electorate, a bit like the Senate system, and if there's a casual vacancy, the 8th person is entitled to be elected. And that meant that Bob Brown could, if he chose, contest a recount of the seat and possibly replace Sanders in Parliament. He had to consider this in prison over Christmas. To do so, he would have to accept bail conditions, so he was out of prison. After Christmas, large numbers of rafters, of whom I was one, commenced the trip down the Franklin River to join the blockade. We were buzzed twice a day by HEC helicopters. Others travelled direct to Strawn, where the Wilderness Society had a shop premises and a large base camp called Greeny Acres for training protesters. The protesters were arranged into affinity groups for close mutual support. Media communications were handled by Bob Burton, now in jail, and Jeff Law. And an impressive legal team was headed by Lincoln Siliakis. One of the legal team was Pierre Slicer, who in fact was arrested and held on the usual conditions of which he wouldn't accept the bail terms. He was sent to jail. He later became a Supreme Court judge in Tasmania. From Strawn, once they'd completed training, protesters moved upriver by boat to the various camps in the bush along the Gordon River. On the 1st of January 1983, Bob Brown, still in prison, was named by the Australian newspaper the Australian of the Year. On the 4th of January, Bob Brown accepted the bail conditions with the utmost protest and was released from custody. He was already in a commanding lead in the recount, and the following day was declared elected to State Parliament. On the river, protests continued. Thousands were coming to Strawn to participate in the blockade. Our rafting team, having descended the Franklin and its great ravine and climbed Frenchman's Cap on the way, reached the Gordon River, where, as I mentioned, we were surrounded by police boat, and we camped with protesters in the forest, attending group meetings and helping with administration, carting gear to and from boats and logistics. I was a new barrister and I knew that I didn't wish to be arrested, so I helped in the background rather than taking a stand on the river. We were there when Don Chipp visited the blockade and saw the impressive ocean-going yachts moored in the middle of the river where the media were based. The police were a constant presence up and down the river. Soon new bail conditions were imposed, preventing blockaders from returning to the municipality of Gormanston, west of the King River, that's to say Queenstown and Strawn. Then things began to get nasty. On the 12th of January, in the small hours, rocks were hurled through the windows of the Wilderness Society's info centre in Strawn, injuring one person. Radio equipment was jammed. All public telephones in Queenstown and Strawn simultaneously were out of order, and the telex cables in and out of the Wilderness Society's info centre were cut. Sometime later, well after the controversy was over, police admitted that they had done all of this, which was of course completely illegal. That morning, the road to the protesters' base camp was blocked by a police car, and any protester attempting to pass was arrested. 80 police escorted the first bulldozer on a low loader into Strawn. Protesters were pulled from underneath the wheels of the moving truck and were arrested. The bulldozer was successfully loaded onto a barge. Following day, the dozer left Strawn at dawn on a barge towed by the Cape Martin. The boat ploughed through a ducky blockade without slowing and passed over a submerged diver without any regard for the diver's flag. Police did nothing to prevent this dangerous situation. The dozer was unloaded and began destroying the rainforest at Warner's Landing. That night in Strawn, 4 youths wielding a wheel brace attacked Bob Brown. Bob Brown managed to get hold of the wheel brace and the youths fled. Later they admitted that they had kicked him a number of times in the head. They appeared in court the next day and were released, unlike the protesters, to be feted as heroes in Queenstown. Lincoln Siliakis was appearing for protesters in Queenstown court, and after a long day in court he climbed into his car for the winding journey back to Strawn. On the way he realised that his wheels were loose. Someone had carefully loosened all the nuts in an apparent attempt to make him crash. The Tasmanian Supreme Court upheld an appeal against the extreme bail conditions, and they would no longer be imposed, and the Supreme Court also disqualified a magistrate for bias. The momentum of the protests became enormous. Shane Howard's group, Goanna, after travelling to the area with Bob Brown, renamed themselves Gordon and the Franklins and made a hit song, Let the Franklin Flow. I think Red Gum also participated in this recording. The whole project lasted a week from beginning to write the song to recording it. Professor David Bellamy, with 53 others, was arrested at Warner's Landing, and footage of his arrest was shown in 32 countries and created banner headlines in London's Fleet Street. He was remanded in custody, and all up, some 1,500 people were arrested during the blockade and more than 1,000 were jailed, straining Tasmania's prisons to breaking point. On the 19th of January, Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser made an offer of $500 million for Tasmania to stop the construction of the dam. Bob Brown described this as a charade because the Prime Minister knew of its rejection in advance. Robin Gray described it as totally unacceptable. Bob Brown now announced that the Wilderness Society would campaign against the coalition at the forthcoming election. Opposition leader Bill Hayden toured the Franklin with Bob Brown, and in the Gordon River Gorge, workers set off an explosion in an AIDIT, cannoning boulders out over the river, less than 100 metres behind Bill Hayden's boat. Hayden reaffirmed the Labor Party's commitment to saving the river, but Bill Hayden was in trouble in his own party. Bob Hawke was Labor's rising star and could take over at any time. Malcolm Fraser knew this and wanted an election before the more popular Bob Hawke became his opponent. To preempt the Labor Party change of leaders, on the 3rd of February 1983, Fraser drove to Yarralumla and advised the Governor-General to hold a double dissolution election on the 5th of March 1983. But before Fraser could announce the date, the dramatic news came that Hayden had resigned the leadership of the Labor Party. Fraser would have to campaign against Bob Hawke. On the 4th of February, with this news just fresh in everyone's ears, a rally was held against the dam in Hobart, and an extraordinary 20,000 people attended, giving Bob Brown a huge ovation. In the election campaign that followed, in an arrangement suggested by Barry Jones, the Wilderness Society urged voters to put the Democrats first in the Senate and Labor first in the lower house. I attended a huge rally in Melbourne at which Bob Hawke spoke with Bob Brown. Hazel Hawke wore no dams earrings. 2 days before the election, an advertisement was placed in the Melbourne Age and in the Sydney Morning Herald. It was a stunning full-page colour poster of a Peter Dombrovskis photograph, Morning Mist, Rock Island Bend on the Franklin River. It had the caption, "Could you vote for a party that would destroy this?" Now, up to that time, colour was virtually unknown in newspapers. They were all black and white. So this poster was electrifying, and it was seen on suburban fridges for years afterwards. Now, the photo was taken by Peter Dombrovskis during a trip down the river with Don Chip and Norm Sanders and Edun Chip. They were there when the photo was taken. And it's an extraordinary image. When the election was held, Labor lost all 5 Tasmanian seats, but won a majority nationwide. For those of us who had campaigned for the Franklin, it was an extraordinary moment. Bob Hawke's only election night commitment was, "The dam will not go ahead." But it was not over. On the 31st of March 1983, the Commonwealth enacted regulations making work on the dam illegal. The Commonwealth relied on several powers given to it under the Constitution, including external affairs, corporations, and in relation to the cultural sites, the race power. Most emphasis was on the external affairs power because of the World Heritage listing of the Wild Rivers area. The next day, Robin Gray announced that the regulations would be ignored and work would continue. The Commonwealth Parliament now passed legislation to prevent the dam being constructed. On the 4th of April 1983, the Commonwealth commenced proceedings in the High Court of Australia seeking an injunction to prevent work on the dam and a declaration that its legislation was valid. The High Court now prepared to hear what is still the most important case in Australian constitutional history, the Franklin Dam case. At issue was not the merit of the dam proposal, but whether the Commonwealth had power to override a state in this matter. The case was argued for 2 weeks. Now, I knew several of the barristers involved in the case at that time, and the word that I was hearing was that there were 3 judges who seemed to be in favour of the Commonwealth's case and 3 in favour of Tasmania's case. The High Court hearing a constitutional case always has the full 7 justices. There was 1 judge swinging. On the 1st of July 1983, the parties gathered in the High Court in Brisbane for the result. Everyone knew it would be close. By 4 justices to 3, the court upheld the Commonwealth's legislation. The Franklin River was saved, and so runs free to the sea. The following weekend, angry hydro workers went to the iconic Lee tree, a Huon pine estimated to be 3,000 years old, that many visitors to the area took time and the pilgrimage to see. They drilled it, filled the holes with petrol, chainsawed it and set fire to it. The intensity of their fire can be seen in the photograph they took of their handiwork. Though badly damaged, the Lee tree survived. We're going to finish with the video of the Shane Howard song.